special pleasure for me, one of my great friends and probably the most knowledgeable person on the intersection of law and political science in the democracy space. Nate Persily is joining us today from Stanford. And this is the first time he's talked about these issues since the 2024 election. So I think we're in for a great discussion. He's going to speak for about 30 minutes. I've got plenty of questions, but we'll see how it goes. But I want to hear questions from you if you have questions. Let me briefly read some of his bio. His full bio is available on Stanford's website. Nate Persily is the James B. McClatchy Professor of Law at Stanford Law School with appointments in the Department of Political Science, Communication, and the Friedman Spogli Institute of International Studies. He's the founding co-director of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center and its program on democracy and the internet, as well as the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project. His scholarship addresses issues such as voting rights, political parties, campaign finance, redistricting, and election administration, all topics covered in his co-authored election law casebook, The Law of Democracy. He's been a court-appointed special master to craft congressional legislative districting plans in Georgia, Maryland, Connecticut, New Hampshire, New York, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. I will just say that anything Nate writes or speaks about is worth hearing, and I'm going to come down and just listen to what Nate has to say. Thank you very much. Please join me in welcoming.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. The feeling is mutual. You are so lucky here at UCLA to have Rick Hasson, and we in the election law field are so lucky to have him. It's hard to think of anyone in any field who provides as much service to an academic discipline as Rick Hasson does to the election law field. Even when I was a law student, I remember him running the election law listserv, the election law blog. It's really amazing how much he does for others in this field, including me throughout my career. And so I'm very appreciative and thrilled to be here today to talk to you. I'll start with some slides whenever you're ready. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about the 2024 election, what's happening in 2025, and then implications for the 2026 election. And so there's a lot to cover, and I will try to go as fast through the history as possible. Here's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the results of the 2024 election, how people voted, dogs that didn't bark, sort of things that we were worried about that didn't actually materialize, but other things that were problems that didn't get a whole lot of attention, what I'll call canaries in the coal mine, such as fights over voter registration lists, controversies over mail balloting, and even a significant number of bomb threats to election offices. Then I'll talk about what's happening right now with these new executive orders, new pressures on the election system through these data requests. Since you've got a presentation next week on gerrymandering, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, only insofar as I think it's going to have an impact on this upcoming election. Then I'll talk a little bit about what are some of the new challenges and new threats with respect to 2026. And here, I don't want to sort of catastrophize, but we're in the realm right now of speculation as to how might this unprecedented election be run. For those who know me, I have tended to be a voice that tries to calm people down in elections, whether it's through work on NBC or as an academic. I think we're entering a unique phase when it comes to election administration and the challenges that might be posed in the 2026 election. I think it's a critical time. I think it's going to be a watershed moment. Every one of the last 3 elections, everyone said it's like the most important election in our lifetime or something like that. I do think that's true for the 2026 election because of the unprecedented challenges that are going to be facing people who run it.
We're going to minimize that too.
Yeah. And so, so I'll talk about that. So the clicker is not working. Okay, let's just talk about what happened in the 2024 election quite quickly. So voter turnout was actually extremely high by historical standards, not as high as it was in the 2020 election. Ironically, where you might have expected there to be a decline in turnout given that it was the COVID election, but 63.3% of the eligible population is still an extremely high turnout. You can see as compared to the last 60 plus years, it's the second highest turnout. The results, you've got basically a 2 million vote advantage for Donald Trump, though it was actually, if you think about these three states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, it's really only about 230,000 votes that decided the election in the Electoral College. And so if you had split, or if you'd flipped half of that number, you might have actually gotten a different result. It was an unsurprising election, okay, as much as it was so dramatic. The factors that we as political scientists look at to predict elections would have told you that Donald Trump would have won. Why? Because Joe Biden was so unpopular, right? People thought the economy was doing poorly. And when you have 73% of the population thinking that you're on the wrong track as a country, you would expect the incumbent party to lose. Here's where we are today. It's not as high as it was, 10 months ago, but there's still 55% of Americans who think that we are on the wrong track, 37% who say we are headed in the right direction. And it seems to be, declining, if anything, but we'll see what happens there. For all of the casting of doubt on the 2024 election, both before and to some extent afterwards, you see that most Americans were quite confident in the vote. And yes, of course, if you look at the 2020 election, you only have 22% of Republicans who were confident that the nationwide sort of vote count was correct. Now, unsurprisingly, their confidence after the 2024 election was up to 88%. Democrats declined by about 13%, so only 79% were in favor or had confidence or a lot of confidence. And so you've got confidence in the 80s for both parties or the average voter. And as has always been the case, people have high degrees of confidence that their own vote was counted. And as you abstract out, they get lower and lower confidence as you move from the state, from your vote to the county, to the state, to nationwide, right? So people believe there are problems, but it's usually someplace else, right? How did we vote? So when you look at the way that the trends in mail balloting, we obviously had a huge increase in mail balloting in the 2020 elections, where 43% or so ended up voting by mail. That has dropped down in 2024 to about 29%, but it's still the case that if you look over time, the number of people who are voting on election day in polling places is now a minority of Americans. You're seeing the increase in in-person early voting. So roughly 30% even numbers of people are voting in person early as they are voting by mail. By the way, just to get a little, existentialist about this, what it means to vote by mail versus vote early is actually not an easy question to answer, because so many people now are actually dropping their mail ballots off at these early voting places. So there's this kind of almost identity crisis as to how you categorize this stuff. Nevertheless, what we're seeing is, less trust or less willingness to vote by mail and more voting in person early, but the election day vote is declining. It is still the case that most of the mail balloting is happening in states like our own here in California, so that the Western states are predominantly voting by mail, though you can see in 2020, the sort of light blue states where you had roughly half the votes that were being cast by mail. But you look at 2024, and it's still a predominantly Western phenomenon. As I mentioned before, it's not just because you call it mail balloting doesn't mean that people are voting by post office, right? So let's say around 70% of the votes are returned, or 60% are returned by mail, but others are being returned by drop boxes at election offices and in polling places. Almost 2/3 of states used ballot drop boxes in some way or another. So this is not like some I don't know, aberrant behavior. People have drop boxes because that's often the easiest way for people to vote, or the states have them. So 67 mail ballots were sent to voters in the 2024 election, 72% were returned. About 1% of those were rejected. Most of the time, if they are rejected, it is because of an incomplete signature or a non-matching signature. That's the kind of most frequent reason. I mentioned this statistic of the 500,000 ballots or so that were set aside, mail ballots, about more than half of them were successfully cured. This is going to become important later on because the standards for how you cure ballots ended up being a kind of issue of litigation. Just to be clear, because I might have gone a little bit fast there, right? If you've got a mail ballot problem, say where the signature is hard to read or not to match, sometimes what will happen is you will either get a phone call or you on your or some email or text message that says there's a problem with your ballot. You would then go to an election office. You would try to then say, here's who I am. You sign something and then you cure the defect. There are other ways to cure it besides visiting an election office sometimes too. And so most of them ended up being cured, but it's still, you're talking about hundreds of thousands that were not. And I know this is small for people to read, but for the most part, the problems that we saw in polling places were not significant. But you're still talking about kind of millions of problems, right? So part of the difficulty here is that, and this is going to be true for the 2026 election, for most people, which is not to say like 51%, for almost everybody in the 90 percentage points, it is going to feel like any other election, right? But there will be high profile examples of problems. And the real issue is whether they're going to be for 2026, is whether those problems are going to be concentrated in the battleground districts that'll determine the House of Representatives. And so if you look at issues about, there were instances where people were taking pictures on election day. That's not terribly surprising. People sometimes, they're taking selfies everywhere. You've got 2% of people in the Eve survey who say that they were, or excuse me, this is the survey that performs the American elections run by the incomparable Charles Stewart at MIT. So you have like 2 or 3% of people this time, just like 4 years ago, saying that they saw a voter disputing another voter's status, right? And all these other kinds of phenomena that we've been taking surveys of over the last few years. So it's low percentage numbers, but it's still a high number of voters who are viewing these kinds of problems in polling places. What about provisional ballot? So a provisional ballot is what you get when you come to the polling place and say, you either don't have your ID or your name is not on the rolls, which is the most frequent problem. There were 1.7 million voters who had to cast provisional ballots, and close to 3/4 of them were counted, which is comparable to what we saw in the last 2 elections. Most of the rejections, so of that 25% or so that were not counted, most of it is because they weren't on the voter registration list, which gives you a sense of like how important the voter registration lists are for the performance of the polling place. So if we end up with sort of incomplete voting lists or challenges to voters or purges of voters, that one would expect the provisional ballot numbers to go up. This is the 2024 Eve survey, which is published by the Election Assistance Commission. It's not complete data for all states, and so we want to take it with a grain of salt, but my guess is that the percentages are probably accurate. All right, so what were we worried about beforehand? When I was giving a talk like this before the 2024 election, people were freaking out about AI deepfakes. Sure, there were lots of deep fakes in the election, right? None of them seemed to have any political significance. You see most of them were kind of memeified, satirical pictures, picking up on what was happening in Ohio. You'd see, these pictures of Donald Trump hugging cats and ducks and things like that, or pictures of Kamala Harris in a Communist Party outfit or something like that. None of it was like deceptive, where it was leading people to believe that something was happening that wasn't. There are a few examples of where politicians tried to disclaim something that was true and say it was a deep fake. I can go into this. I don't think you saw much in the way of an impact of so-called vote suppression laws. No significant fraud, even though, of course, there's always allegations of it. No significant violence, though I want to return to this in talking about the bomb threats that we saw. Because the margin of victory was so large, we did not say it was tremendous, right? But it was large enough so that any of the problems that we saw didn't sort of fly above the radar. But I'll come back to some of this as warning signs for the 2026 election. But what did happen that kind of didn't really get a lot of attention because the election seemed to be relatively smooth. So and again, this is the canaries in a coal mine section of this talk, which is we saw some things happening in the 2024 election with litigation that now are playing out as we run up to the 2026 election. Challenging of overseas voters. Okay, UOCAVA voters are uniformed and overseas voters. And so there were challenges in North Carolina and some other states about whether these people who were voting abroad were actually legitimate voters in the state, okay? In addition, there were, as there always are in elections, concerns about purges of the voter rolls for ineligible voters. What we saw was one of the things that's interesting, and which I hadn't quite picked up on in the data historically, is that the share of UOCAVA voters, which marries both military voters and these overseas voters, the composition is shifting a little bit, so that you end up with 70% of those voters are actually not uniformed citizens, they're not military. That's important because if you think about what the partisan distribution might be of Americans living abroad who are not military versus those who are military, you've got a repository of voters, which then you can make sort of predictable challenges, all right? 3.7% of the UOCAVA votes were rejected, mostly because they come in late, right? So if you're in Iraq and you're sending in, ballots, they might arrive late. Less covered is the number of bomb threats that happened in the 2024 election, which shocked me. I was in New York for NBC News, doing election commentary, or supposedly going to do election commentary. I was just sitting there waiting for some disaster to happen, and nothing happened. But there was really very little reporting. There was one sort of set of reports on election day about alleged Russian hoax bomb threats in a few polling places. I had tracked about 50 that I saw. The Brennan Center says that there were over 227 bomb threats, and you can see the publication on their site. But these are, again, nothing that actually happened, but these were phone calls that election offices were getting, and that polling places, threats to blow up polling places. Again, we don't have historical data on the number of bomb threats. I don't really know that this is an increase, though it seems like it must be, right? That seems like a pretty significant increase. And so to look at the data and all the links to the local news coverage of this, I encourage you to look at the Brennan Center's website on there. What we also saw, and this is a ticking time bomb, is in Pennsylvania in particular, inconsistent procedures for curing those ballots. Remember, I talked about curing, say, mail ballots and the like. And that is something that we should expect. That's the kind of litigation that eventually is going to lead, in a close election, could lead to a so-called Bush versus Gore problem in a state like Pennsylvania. It depends, again, in this upcoming election, whether those inconsistencies would affect, say, a competitive congressional district. I want to focus, though, on late counting, because late counting it has not proven to be an issue, a decisive issue in a federal election yet. But we here in California, you all in Southern California in particular, need to be paying attention to this. And this is something that I think we really need to be concerned about as we approach the 2026 election, where, even though California is not a battleground state in presidential elections, it has several congressional districts that are going to be competitive, even a greater number if the gerrymandering bill ends up being passed. And so California was extremely late. You can see how late they are relative to the rest of the country. All right, so that's 2020. This is 2020, 2024. So each one of these lines is a state. And this, again, Charles Stewart did this for me. He is incredibly generous to produce this for just a PowerPoint for me. But you can see that even one day, 1 week out, there were still like 10% of the ballots that hadn't been counted in California. So if we are in a situation in 2026 where who controls the House of Representatives depends on California, we're going to be in a heap of trouble if the counting of that, right? Because you can imagine what conspiracy theories are going to come and sort of fill the void in that week after the votes are cast. I mentioned the bomb threats. We are also seeing a steady decline, or a steady increase in the number of election officials who are resigning and a steady decline in their seniority, right? So that you end up with, this is from the Bipartisan Policy Center, the sheriff, chief local election officials with 6 or more years in their role over time. You go back to 2006 or so, majority of them had 6 or more years in their role. Now it's below 50%, below 48%, right? And so the turnover in election officials, because look, this is now becoming a job where people are getting death threats all the time. They're getting all these burdensome data requests, which are really occupying their time. All right, so now what about the newest challenges to voting that we're seeing in 2025? I want to go through the executive orders, other public policy changes, these data requests that are coming fast and furious. I won't talk a whole lot about gerrymandering, except to say the following. That the common theme of all these challenges that I'm articulating here is not so much that you're going to, yes, there's the chance of vote suppression, intimidation, violence, I'll talk about that. But I'm just as concerned about things that cause confusion and chaos, right? So this perception that things are going awry. And gerrymandering, these kind of, the reshuffling of districts does all kinds of, it creates all kinds of problems when it comes to election administration. So for example, when I've drawn, as Rick was mentioning, I've drawn lots of maps. One of the things that always happens is like you end up, people end up having to shift their polling place, right? And so people are going to show up at the wrong location because now the districts have changed and they maybe you'll end up voting in new locations. And so gerrymandering and this kind of chaos that is happening right now in the districting system has an election administration component to it. And by the way, depending on what the Supreme Court does with this case next week, Louisiana versus Calais, you may even see other states coming into the mix and redistricting. I'll talk briefly about ICE National Guard, though you all are just as expert on what they might end up doing because we're just like, we're trying to hypothesize how federal troops might be used to undermine the vote. And then I'll talk a little bit about the post office. So let's just look at the main Trump executive order that has come out, but which has been put on hold by a district court. And this is mainly about proof of citizenship requirements for voters, right? Now, the court has ruled that this requirement in the executive order that voters show documentary proof of citizenship is beyond the power of the president. It's not terribly surprising. We don't have if Joe Biden wanted to say, oh, no one has to put it to show ID, that would also be unconstitutional, right? We delegate these kinds of decisions to the states with some exceptions for things like the Help America Vote Act, the National Voter Registration Act, and other federal statutes, but it's not like the president can just start issuing voter qualifications. But there is, I'll just say, there is the possibility that over the next year, we will have a piece of legislation in Congress that will require proof of citizenship. There's a lot of support for that, particularly on the Republican side. In addition, Trump at least has promised to issue executive orders that would do things, well, as he says, I'm going to lead a movement to get rid of mail-in ballots, and also while we're at it, highly inaccurate, very expensive, and seriously controversial voting machines. So I'm not exactly sure what that means, but it's most of the way we vote in this country. And so I don't know exactly, whether it's through federal legislation, executive action, or control of the Postal Service, how that kind of promise would be executed. Cleta Mitchell, who's one of the lawyers who has been representing Trump, right, has said that the president's authority is limited in his role in regard to elections, except where there's a threat to the national sovereignty of the United States, as I think we can establish with the porous system that we have. Then I think maybe the president's thinking that he will exercise some emergency powers to protect the federal elections going forward. So you can see what the promises might be. I don't know exactly how that would be implemented. This issue of the data requests, there's two sides of this. Ever since really the 2020 election, and maybe even earlier, local election officials have been burdened with all kinds of FOIA requests and requests for data, usually as part of, by private parties. And so they end up having to produce all this information about, the ballot results or the registered voters or things like that. Now that has been sort of federalized, and so we've got the Department of Justice that is issuing requests to these states in order to turn over their voter lists. Now, why is that consequential? In the ordinary course of things, it might not be, but the question is, what would they do with it? And so I think part of the concern here, and this is also with Doge if Doge matches it with other kinds of sources of federal data, is we'll end up with arguments about how, the lists in this particular state are so inaccurate. And anybody who does this kind of data matching knows that when you take, like, say, the change of address data or the deaths, the birth and death records, and you match it up with the voting records, you're always going to get all these names and birth dates that end up erroneously being canceled off the voting rolls. And so we may go through that again, but this is going to be part of, I think, an effort to try to suggest that there's a lot of fraudulent voters on the rolls, non-citizens, dead voters, voters who are ineligible. But again, it's also a burden on the electoral system that these data requests are coming forward. And some of the states are complying with this and some are not. And so the DOJ has sued 6 states for now. Here you can see who is complying. This again, I think is also a Brennan Center report, that the green states haven't provided any lists because a lot of them have not been requested. The yellow states have been sued. The blue states have just provided what's publicly available because a lot of the voter data is already available. And the red states are, many of them provided different kinds of lists. All right, I don't know what to say about federal troops and ICE and how that might be used in the election because we've never really been in that world before. But it's certainly something, if you believe some of the warnings that have been issued, right, we may be in a situation where federal troops could be, the National Guard and ICE might play a role here. Interestingly, there is a law on the books that prevents the military from sort of occupying polling places. You can understand why that law might be important. And so we will see. You can expect some kind of, I think, concern that this might happen. Again, as with all things, it's not going to happen nationwide. And the question is, where would it happen with maximal impact on the competitive congressional seats? Now let me talk about one thing that no one's talking about, but now when I started being an election professor, I had a full head of beautiful hair, okay? And then over time, I started with Bush versus Gore, and then, every year, I pull it out or it falls out on its own because of different concerns. All right, here's one that's keeping me up at night, which is that if it is a close election in the 2026 election, there is a situation under which we will not, we will not be able to seat a majority of Congress because the Congress determines the qualifications of its own members. And so we could end up being in a process. It's sort of analogous to what was happening with Mike Pence and everything that was happening in the presidential race a few years ago. But here, the question is, how do you know, right, whether someone is a validly elected member of Congress? The procedure under the House rules is that anyone may object to anyone being seated, and then there is a vote on them. But you have a chicken and egg problem here because you only can have a vote if the Congress has been seated. And so we could potentially be entering a period of uncertainty as to who actually controls the Congress, okay? And it's not as if the previous Congress is the one that then ends up deciding these issues. It's usually, and we've never been in this situation before. Again, I don't want to like raise this sort of undue alarm. Too late. Except as we sort of think about a January 6th kind of situation, this is something that I think we need to think about. All right, so now that I freaked you out, let me just talk about why some of these concerns might be overstated. And this is because this is not a presidential election where you have half a dozen or so battleground states where you can concentrate resources just in those states. You have battleground districts, competitive districts in many, many parts of the country. And in fact, with these redistrictings, it may even be more. And a lot will change. These are the Cook Political Report estimates of where these competitive districts will be. And so it's, you know, what you would expect, whether it's the use of troops, federal forces, or other kinds of, it's going to be unpredictable in some ways where those resources would be dedicated, because you know they're depending on where public opinion is in the run up to the election. It really is, let's say, 20 to 30 different congressional districts that one would have to keep an eye on, and I think is you know, and many of these are not in states that would be most likely to say, you know, engage in nefarious activity. All right, let's talk about what is to be done, and then let me open it for questions. So first, we in California have to get our act together. I know this is in some ways blaming the victim here, but California we cannot live in a world where we don't know the results of these congressional districts until a week or more after the election, or even several weeks. Our laws here allow for votes to be counted if they're cast by election day, but they can get counted within 3 weeks or so of the election. That law needs to be changed, but more importantly, it's really a resource question. We need to get resources down to LA, Orange County, where there are going to be significant competitive congressional districts, so that they have enough resources to count all the mail ballots that they receive. Second, this again, you know, seems like a kind of capitulation, but we need to move away from mail balloting, because mail balloting is not because it's insecure, not because it's ripe for fraud, but because of the way that it can be affected by the Postal Service, as well as a source of conspiracy theories. That doesn't mean we should eliminate mail balloting, to be clear, right? There are some states like Oregon, Washington, Utah, where you have 100% of the ballots that are cast by mail. But we need to encourage people to vote in person early. Third, since we are not in the crisis situation about seating the House of Representatives, we need to come up with rules now. And I know that seems fanciful because you can't even agree on a continuing resolution in Washington right now. But since we don't know who might be benefited or harmed by it, just to say, well, what are the rules to challenge the qualifications of newly elected members? And then last, thinking about the resilience of the system, I think, you know, I'm raising this issue of the National Guard and ICE now. I think it's important for us to think through what those rules are going to be with the election. The states need to be clear about what they're going to do in the event this happens. And then and because it's still going to be close to a third of votes are probably going to be cast by mail, if not more. We need to make sure that the traditional role of the Postal Service remains intact, and that both of their mailing out of mail ballots and then the return will happen on the sort of as expedited through the expedited process that they've done historically. That was a lot to throw at you in half an hour. I'm eager to hear your questions.
Thank you for that. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions here. I just want to open up just by asking you your last point about perceptions versus reality. One of the arguments that's made about, for example, saying California's got to have a earlier deadline for mail-in ballots is that this is going to disenfranchise people, and we shouldn't bow down to conspiracy theories. We should maximize the opportunities for enfranchisement. How do you think we should balance the kind of the real world consequences of people believing that their votes are not accurately counted with the reality that our election system is generally fair and free of fraud?
Yeah, I think that you know, if we lived in an ideal world where people trusted the process and were patient, right, and that conspiracy theories didn't fill the void in the period after the polls closed and to the time that we know results, then fine. I mean, there are other countries in the world that use, you know, India most significantly, which holds its elections over months, right? So you can run a democracy that way. You just can't run this democracy that way right now, right? Because of the pressures that are put on the system. And so, like I said, I know that I'll get accused of blaming the victim here or capitulating, as you said, to the conspiracy theorists, but we need to build resilience into the system. We need to understand what's going to happen, right? We saw this in 2020. We're seeing it being sort of forecasted as we go forward. And so no one is going to be, I mean, to call it disenfranchisement, to say that you probably, if you get a mail ballot, you should vote as early as possible, doesn't sound to me like disenfranchisement. It just means we have to send a signal out that you got to get this stuff in as soon as possible in order to have it counted, right? And by the way, to encourage people to do what I was saying before, which is that when they do vote by mail, turn it into the election office or turn it into the polling place.
All right, one more question, then I promise I will go to the audience. And this is, how much of this is a Trump-specific phenomenon and versus how much is this more of a systemic problem? And there's going to be a time when Donald Trump is not going to be president. Do we go back to normal with how our elections are run, or has this changed things in such a significant way that we have to think that we're going to have difficult contestation over election administration for the foreseeable future?
So I do think we are going to have that kind of contestation. Part of the reason I believe that is it's not just happening in the United States. You're seeing this in other parts of the world where people are losing confidence in the election infrastructure. Now, other parts of the world have trust in civil servants that we here in the United States don't have, and that's a very important factor. In addition, other parts of the world have trust in a neutral media sort of speaker. So in Scandinavia or even the BBC, right, in Britain, there is trust in certain kinds of news organizations. We don't have that in the US. PBS, even when it was funded, was never trusted that way, let alone NPR. And so, so I think there's a problem with the decentralized media ecosystem and how ripe it is for conspiracy theories that is not just Trump specific. Now, everybody who studies misinformation knows that most misinformation comes from the top. Okay, so that includes elected politicians, but it also includes major media organizations as well as influencers, right? And so the question is, will there still be people with megaphones who can propagate the conspiracy theories that then people will believe? And that is just a function of the fact that we are incredibly polarized as a country, and people will take their signals from the leaders that they trust. Now, I don't think that there's anyone on the Republican side, say, that has the megaphone that Donald Trump does, but but that's because he's got the megaphone now. We'll see what happens, in the coming years, whether there'll be many different megaphones or whether, and maybe you'll also get one on the Democratic side that has that kind of significance.
Okay, let's open it up to questions. Yes.
Is there a situation where elections are not held in 2026?
No, I don't think so. I could see some argument at some point where someone says, oh, there's so much fraud. There are situations if you're at war or if you are, if there's a natural disaster where particular areas might have delays in elections. That causes all kinds of problems because there is a federal election day. But the states are going to run elections, right? Because not only is Congress on the ballot, but you've got state elections. And so the Constitution says that the states shall determine the time, place, and manner of elections subject to revision by Congress. And so I don't see a scenario under which we don't have an election, though there could be attempts to try to say, all right, in this area, it's so ripe with fraud that the federal government is going to do something. Yes.
Yeah, your concern about mail-in balloting, you link to the USPS. So does it extend to the drop-off boxes, the ballot drop-off boxes?
Well, here's the way, and I might have glossed over this too quickly. It is still we don't have a national authority on elections in the United States, right? When I give talks around the world on this, it's like they're shocked by this. How can you not have a federal election authority? Like the Federal Election Commission basically does campaign finance. The Election Assistance Commission, which is hanging by a thread, does a lot of sort of reports and standard setting and things like that. To the extent we have a national election authority, it is the Postal Service, okay? So the Postal Service, because they are in charge, they are going to be delivering, let's say, a third of ballots. If you were worried about monkeying with the system, right, that is where you would find it. So that's why, and remember, the Postal Service is doing three things related to the elections. First of all, they send out election information. They send out the ballots, and then they return the ballots that are done through the post office, right? The drop boxes, right, only solve that last problem, right, which is where the depositing of the ballot. I think that drop boxes are, fine and great, and it's sort of the conspiracy theory surrounding them I always find sort of mystifying. It's like, oh my gosh, the drop boxes, people are dumping thousands of ballots in them. It's like, well, if we painted them blue and had them outside of mail offices, right? And we didn't call them drop boxes, but we called them mailboxes. Would you do the same? It's like the drop boxes are just as secure as any of these other things. So I think the drop boxes solve some of these problems, but there are conspiracy theories around the drop boxes too, right? And so returning the ballots to the early voting centers, to the election authorities is, the safest option. A lot of these drop boxes, like there are drop boxes and there are drop boxes. Just as I was kind of getting existential about what a mail ballot is, it's like, how close does the drop box need to be to a person before it is no longer a drop box and it's just giving it to that person to deposit, to count? Because there are drop boxes that are in election offices, right? And then there are drop boxes that are, sprinkled around cities where people can put their ballots in. Some of these drop boxes have like 24-hour surveillance cameras that are over them, to make them really, really secure, which is always kind of ironic because, if the post office box is over here and it doesn't have a camera, you could just drop it in there. No, but if you want to drop it in the drop box, you have to, give a blood sample. But anyway, but that's the world we live in. There's no reason to think that drop boxes are, inherently less secure or ripe for fraud than say mailboxes are.
Jake.
You talked about the decline in number of at various levels of election officials. Can you talk about what we're seeing in terms of who's replacing them?
Yeah. Well, most of the data on this is actually encouraging, that the people who are replacing them are people who have been working in election offices. That is in general the case, and that those who remain, right, the long-term election officials who remained are really the stalwart folks who are dedicated to the process. We have been concerned, right, historically, that what would happen is you'd get seasoned election officials who are like look, I'm not gonna deal with this crap anymore, right? And then conspiracy theorists then occupy those posts. Undoubtedly, that has happened some places. It doesn't seem to be a systematic problem. But for those who are online, I could be wrong on that, and I don't have all the data. But from what I hear from people in the field, it's not as if the people who are replacing these seasoned election officials are, incompetent or ripe for conspiracy theories.
I was struck by what you said about how now that the concern is about Congress rather than about the presidency, rather than focusing on a handful of battleground states like you and I were studying Pennsylvania election law in great detail. Now, competitive races could be not in those states.
Yeah.
So have you looked at where the competitive election, which states are they likely to be? You mentioned California.
Yeah.
And California, I agree with you completely that there's enough time now to up the resources so that California can count those ballots much more quickly if there's the will to do it. Where else do you?
Well, California and New York will have a significant number of seats. Texas will, because of the redistricting. And then you've got like spotty ones here and there, right? That are across the country. Depending on what happens with the Missouri and Indiana redistrictings, maybe Florida you could end up having some of these competitive seats there as well. But you'll have some in Colorado. You've got some, spread around. Washington, I think, has one. It was on the Cook Political Report, and that's going to change, right? It passes prologue. You're going to end up seeing over the next year the number of competitive seats shifting, right? And especially with the redistricting, but also just the nature of the beast. I mean, and by the way, I didn't say this pointedly enough. My point about showing the right direction, wrong track numbers was to say that 2026 should be a predictable election as well. Right, that in a midterm election with an incumbent president who hasn't had huge coattails, and you have a majority of Americans who think that we're on the wrong track, you would expect a shift of some percentage of congressional seats, enough for the Democrats to win Congress. Now, that is if the election were held today, right? Who knows what's going to happen sometime over the next year? It could go better, it could go worse. But like I said, the last 3 federal elections have actually gone as you would expect them to. And the question is whether the redistricting is going to create a buffer that would cushion against the effect of the normal rules of political physics here, right? Or whether some of these other activities would make it more difficult for the natural kind of corrective of a midterm election to take effect.
And what are you expecting in terms, if the Supreme Court in the Louisiana versus Calais case actually either strikes down Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act or reads it the way the court did in Brnovich to be essentially not enforceable, would you expect to see another round of redistricting where Alabama, for example, gets rid of its second or maybe both of those Black opportunity districts?
Yeah, so that's again another curveball here. So let's forecast out the timing on this. So the argument is next Wednesday in the Louisiana case. Let's assume now the fact that they asked for re-argument in this case and to do it so soon suggests they want to get a decision out, in 2025 or maybe early 2026. Now we're going to get into real election law nerddom here, so be prepared. Right. So if you have to think about when the primary elections are, not just the primary elections, but the ballot qualification period is by state, so that because potential members of Congress need to know what districts they're going to run in, right? And so in order to do a redistricting, right, you need to have to really know what the districts are by, let's say, January of 2026. And so that means that, you'd have to have, so Louisiana, let's say that case comes out in December, which would be unbelievably fast, but let's assume that it does then. And then you would have to have lawsuits. Either you'd have some states that would take advantage of this decision and do another redistricting that they're not doing now, as well as lawsuits against states that have minority districts or minority opportunity districts that would then lead to, courts ordering that they're they need to be redrawn before the 2026 election. So that, I think it's gonna, you're gonna see some action in this area. I just think the timing is really, really tough.
In the back.
I assume that states have different periods for hearing effective ballots.
Yeah.
Are there any potential problems that arise from that?
Say that, what are the different problems that arise from that?
Yes, that arise.
Yeah, well, so there's the question of differences between states, and then there's questions about differences within states, right, in the county. So I talked about within states, like what's happening in Pennsylvania. That is a problem in Pennsylvania, the fact that you have different actions by different election officials is just something that needs to be dealt with by state law. The differences between states mean that, a problem in some states are very, very restrictive in terms of your ability to cure a problem. And so they're going to have higher rates of canceled ballots than other states. But that's true across the board here, right? That's going to be true with respect to mail ballots, provisional ballots, voter ID laws, all kinds of diversity in between the states on this. And the problem is, here's another, like I said, kind of election law nerddom thing. One thing I didn't mention was the number of I mentioned the number of canceled ballots in the 2024 election. Wasn't that high, but you had certain pockets, like in Clark County near Las Vegas, where you had, many thousands of votes that ended up not being counted, mail ballots. And one of the arguments that I've heard is that it's actually a lot of young people whose signatures didn't match what was on file. And that's because, looking at the young people in the room, none of you learned cursive, and you don't have a consistent signature because you never signed things because you just pay with your phones, right? And so there is a disparate, and I learned about this years ago when I was the research director of the President's Commission on Election Administration. It was the election director for LA County, Dean Logan, who testified before the commission and said, you know what? There's a problem. Kids these days, right, don't know how to sign their name. And you think when you get your driver's license, you write with this looks like this mechanical crayon, right? And then it looks, and that's the signature that's on file. And yes, any other signature that you provide over time will also be in an electronic file. But kids don't have these signatures, right? Kids, 18 to 30-year-olds. And so this is a rising problem. And so a lot of the curing of mail ballot problems is because of the signature mismatch issue. And it's a rising issue in elections.
And if you could just talk about the independent state legislature theory aspect of this, thinking about.
Yeah, all right. So I didn't put that up there. So to the extent that someone besides the legislature in a state, so that would include a local official, that could potentially include a court, is making critical decisions that might be departing from the state law, or filling gaps even with the state laws to say when a ballot could be cured or not. That will then, those issues of state procedure could end up in federal court under this independent state legislature theory that the court in Moore versus Harper did not completely kill off. And so there's still this possibility that you'll end up with lawsuits that say, look, what this local official did or what this local court did is unconstitutional because they're overturning the legislature's will, because it's so beyond the pale that it requires it's unconstitutional under the provision of the Constitution that says that the state legislature will determine how to run the time, place, and manners of conducting congressional elections.
Last question.
Yeah, so you've given us a framework for worry, right? A list of things that could go wrong. But I'm wondering, just to take away from this, if you could make a prediction or predictions as to which of these are most likely to come to fruition and diminish the integrity of the election, diminish contestation, diminish participation.
So each one of those values you had at there's different things that would so I'm focusing on this question of mail ballots because there's so much potential entry points for for compromising the system, whether it's post office or whether problems in the system or the late return of these ballots. That's why I think the easiest thing, even though it's going to cost millions of dollars, is for California and other mail ballot states to step up and make sure that these get counted as soon as possible. Now, there's something that we call the election administrator's prayer, right? And that is, oh God, whatever happens, please don't let it be close. And if this election is like the previous elections, and there's a large margin of victory when it comes to the House of Representatives, everything that I've said to you today is going to be in the dustbin of history, just like most of the other elections when the conspiracy theories and other things that were happening in 2020. So, that's the grain of salt that you need to take with. But I do think none of us would have thought many of the things that have happened over the last 9 months would have happened, right? And so my inclination to be a calming voice is being overtaken by the other voice on my shoulder that is pushing me toward catastrophizing here. And so I do think that there are new concerns that we need to take seriously as early as possible. The other thing is the courts need to step up and resolve these election disputes immediately. There's stuff that's happening in the courts right now related to these DOJ data requests, related to some of these other conflicts over voting lists or interpretation of law. We need the states also, once there is a threat of using federal forces in the states, we need the states to go into court immediately to try to address that. And so, again, in all likelihood, for almost all Americans, which is to say over 90%, it is going to be an uneventful election, right? The question is, in the battleground states, battleground districts, are we going to see some kinds of activity that really is unprecedented? And I think we need to build in resilience, and that gives me some suggestions as to how we can do that, both in the way we direct resources and the way we resolve these controversies as soon as possible.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about, and for me, even more things to worry about, but maybe for others, some reassurance. Please join me in thanking